Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today here in Ottawa. I am mic'd here, and I'm going to give it a shot. If it's too loud, if it's a little bit too forceful, please do let me know. I'm sure I can fill this room quite confidently. Thank you very much again for a kind introduction, and I certainly hope that you will learn something today from the experiences that I had in Mumbai. Before beginning, I'll preface that this work was done in 2004 while I was undertaking my master's degree in London. And to this extent, the presentation is a new one. Some of the pictures that you will see are not my own. I have taken the liberty of using Google to help me put this presentation together. However, I encourage comments and questions and discussion throughout the session, so please do not hesitate to interject, to raise your hand, and to entirely agree on everything that I say. Just to begin, I'm sure many of you have heard of the Millennium Development Goals, the goals that were agreed in 2001 to accomplish by 2015. Now, while there's not a specific urban aspect to that, there are certainly many issues that relate to the urbanization of today's world. One statistic that I came across, which I think is quite interesting and sets the stage for this conversation today, is that by 2020 it is estimated that 1.4 billion people will live in slums. Now, if we think of the context of the Canadian population, it's shocking how many people will live in situations of poverty, with a lack of services, with unsteady or at least unstable income. So this is, I promise this is the only graph you'll see all day. This is a graph which shows the urbanization rate over from 1950 to the year 2030. Now, interestingly enough, we are at the exact time where our world becomes an urbanized world. 2007 and 2008 is when we shift. A picture of Mumbai, and a quote that I found from a journalist while digging in some archives in Mumbai. It immediately conjures up images of high-rise buildings and sprawling slums, of bustling traffic and interminable commuters, and of billionaire industrialists and wretched beggars. I think this is a very appropriate context to start in. For those of us who have been to Mumbai and indeed to India, we know that it's a place of contradiction, a place of great wealth and of an extreme poverty. And I understand that last month you had an excellent speaker who spoke on the world of Bollywood. I had an opportunity to, after having worked in the slums one day, to go to a restaurant opening in the area north of Mumbai where many of the Bollywood stars often frequent. And the name escapes me of that neighborhood. But the differences that I saw between day and night were absolutely astounding. And I think that this really captures that sort of dichotomy. The population of Mumbai is estimated to be about 14 million people. A modest estimate of that is that half, so 7 million or more, live in slums alone. The biggest slum in Asia, Dharavi, as many of you know, is located in Mumbai and has a population of over 1 million people. It has an extremely strong economy. Leather is one of its largest exports. You can find Ralph Lauren polo factories that are actually fully legitimate, that are working there. And yet, the conditions can be absolutely appalling, as this picture shows. So, what is urbanization in Mumbai actually about, and why is this so important? What this is showing is that Mumbai actually lies on a peninsula, and this is extremely important for the formation of slum settlements. Why? Because in the 1980s, when the economy was opened up, foreign firms flooded the area. But what ended up happening was that they ended up concentrating themselves in the south of Mumbai. With such a dense population, that meant that residential areas started to move further and further north. What this then entails is that there's continual movement on a daily basis from the north to the south for employment purposes. This new slide is the slide of the train tracks of Mumbai, and there's three principal lines. The western line, running along the western shore, the central, and the harbor line. These are the lifeline of Mumbai's working population to get from the north down to the south. And what's important about this is that the investments that are made in infrastructure by a city are often based on four things: the rate of economic growth of the city, the technology that's available in the city, the infrastructure that's already in place, and the manpower. Now, given that many developing countries often lack one, two, perhaps even all four of these, it's not surprising that investment in urban areas can be a challenge. When governments do actually manage to invest in urban areas, it may not be in urban housing for their populations. It may be in other things, other priorities. When we take this big picture, what we can see is that the forces that create an informal or a slum settlement are three: the amount of available land, the quality of land, and the nature of its ownership. So some perhaps lesser known facts. Mumbai in the I believe it was the 1980s or early 1990s, was one of the most expensive cities in the world. It exceeded the property land value of New York City. It has three railway lines, like I just mentioned, and importantly, the government is the largest urban landowner. And I'll come back to why this is important. The last point, 7.4 million passenger trips made per day. Many of you who have been there may have seen stuff like that. So, obviously OC Transpo would have a thing or two to say about it. By 1999, there was an estimated, and all numbers are always going to be estimated in these cases, 20,000 households that had been put up within literally meters of the railway track. Before continuing, I wonder if I can request some assistance. When I was going through my photos, I found this one. This is one that I did not actually use in the paper itself. This was right beside the railway track, and I took a picture of it simply because I saw this date, I saw a skull, and I wondered, is this saying that there was a certain number of people? Is there anyone here who can help me understand what that says?
20 accidents happened in 2002 and 2003.
20 accidents.
Sorry?
Sorry? Crossing the railway track.
Accident. This is just not
What I'm thinking about, as you say that, it's very interesting because this was on the right side of the railway track, and to this day,
it's a warning sign. Danger.
don't cross the railway track.
Yeah.
Perhaps a rhetorical question, do you think that there was a bridge that had been built? No. Did I have to cross the railway tracks in order to get on the train? Yes. So, granted, they probably didn't have too many Canadians who were doing research and who were going to be reading that sign. But it's a case in point, going back to the investments in infrastructure that I was talking about. So what does this all mean? Well, there was a law passed. The trains in Mumbai apparently have a maximum speed of about 40 kilometers an hour. But the commissioner said if there are huts, houses, whatever you want to call them, within a certain space of the railway tracks, legally the drivers must slow down to 15 kilometers an hour. So, let's work that back and think about 7.4 million people who should be traveling at 40 kilometers an hour, and all of a sudden they're traveling at 15. The delay in getting to work, in the productivity, in their ability to generate income, obviously starts to mushroom. Now, there was accidents, there was deaths, children were being hit, women were being hit. The drivers were becoming traumatized. What the Commissioner of Railways decided to do was to create a safety zone of 10 meters on either side of the track. And this under the Mumbai Urban Transport Project. Now this project did not only target the railways, it targeted much more. But for my own purposes, I was interested only exclusively in what that meant for the people who lived along the railway tracks. What they intended to do under the MUTP, the Mumbai Urban Transport Project, was to improve the railway tracks, to add landings, to add a number of cars that were available so that there wouldn't be so much crowding. And finally there, to add more rail cars. Sorry, I didn't mention that. So, before getting into the specifics of the work, the big picture that we're dealing with right now is the National Housing Policy was passed in 1994. And I quote, "This was passed so that the central and state governments would take steps to avoid forcible relocation and to undertake selective relocation with community involvement." This was passed under stipulations of the World Bank's loan to the government of India for the MUTP. They had to have this in place. The following year, in 1995, the Slum Redevelopment Scheme was passed. And this was an extremely important piece of legislation for slum dwellers. What it said was that if a household could prove that they had been living in Mumbai before January 1st, 1995, they would be resettled. Preferably in the same location, but if not, somewhere close by that would be to their approval. Now this is an important point that I will come back to, the January 1st, 1995 cutoff date. So what this meant is that 60,000 people were going to be resettled from along the railway tracks alone, let alone other areas included under the MUTP. The bottom line is that what transpired has set an international precedent on what can be done on resettling, not what is always done by any stretch, but what is possible. So that sets our stage in the direction that we're going in today's conversation. What we have to hedge this conversation in is what's the flip side of participation in resettlement. The flip side, as many of us have seen in the newspapers in different countries, is forced evictions. Bulldozers, setting fire, police coming in and dragging people out, kicking down the houses. The effects of forcible eviction are much more than simply losing a structure. It goes way beyond that. But they're often justified. Sure, urban development is necessary. Sometimes people do need to be relocated for that to happen. But when it's hedged in, well, we need to make the city more beautiful. Well, those people are really illegal anyway. Well, it's a slum, it's a center of crime. Well, it's dirty, there's no sanitation, everyone there is going to be sick anyway. That doesn't quite cut it. So, some statistics that you might find surprising. Between the 1950s and the 1990s, approximately 20 million people were displaced and involuntarily resettled as a result of development projects in India. Evidence that only 25% of resettled populations were rehabilitated indicates that the majority of people face severe socioeconomic hardships and are likely to have faced subsequent poverty. Now, recall that I think one slide ago, the existence of the National Housing Policy and the Slum Redevelopment Scheme. Again, these are key issues because many countries might have similar type of legislation or similar governmental bodies that are responsible for overseeing this kind of thing. The mere existence of legislation and bodies does by no means absolutely confirm that these people, that those legislations will be adhered to, will be followed, and that the people will be resettled appropriately. And I think this is a very important point. When people are evicted from their homes, there is the loss of a physical structure. But then, if they are asked to move somewhere or physically removed to somewhere else, they lose their employment. They lose their income-generating activities. If I own a little stand, and then I sell juice to my neighbors, and all of a sudden I have moved out, I lose my market. I lose my customers. If this person has to go somewhere else, the people will be buying from the people they know. Finally, this will have the ramifications of influencing their own food security. If they're not generating income, how are they going to buy their food? But perhaps more importantly, it's the absolute severing, or at least at best, the acute disruption of social networks. And I think this is something that often is overlooked in terms of the value that it plays. If we look around this room, every 2 months or 5 times a year, this group comes together and there's a social bonding that takes place. When you travel, when you go away, often you'll ask your neighbor to keep an eye on my house, would you? If your alarm goes off while you're away, your neighbor will be there to take care of the police that might show up if there's a question. But when you pull people apart from their communities, that is completely disrupted. But more importantly, perhaps, is who gets the brunt of that disruption? Do you think it's the men, the children? It's the women. Women are far and away disproportionately affected by forced evictions in developing countries for a number of reasons. It's judged that women within society have a triple role. There's a role of reproduction, childbirth. There's the productive role, whether it be cooking, collecting firewood, selling perhaps their wares from their house, and of social organization. Now, let's go back to the idea of bulldozers coming in and police coming in. When their husbands, who typically work outside of the house, are away, and these bulldozers come in, rapid flight from the house is extremely complicated. Why? Because they likely have children with them, and they're trying to put together the possessions that they need to take with them in a very short amount of time. And they lack the support, perhaps, of other family members who are able to help them do that rapidly. Once they've been evicted, women retain that role of care provider. Just because they're no longer living in the house doesn't mean that they all of a sudden are giving up their role of providing food for their children or continuing on with their productive roles of trying to sell whatever product they might be using. And this can have the ramifications of influencing their own personal security. When there's a loss of income, when they retain that care provider, the possibility of sexual abuse, entering the sex trade, suffering at the hands of theft, vagrants, increases. The third point, involvement in remedial activities. Now, traditionally, women, as I said, have the sphere inside the home. And this may influence their degree of literacy, the amount that they are able to engage in the external economy, and perhaps by cultural definitions, to becoming involved in planning, in participating, in helping to move forward on a negative situation. Therefore, they're put on the outside of many solutions, and their voice and their opinions are not heard. So what's missing in all this is the participation. Forced evictions doesn't get this kind of turnout. And if you notice, we're all women now. And I'm going to come back to this point. Involvement, participation in relocation allows the individuals to plan, to discuss, and to make informed decisions in a timely fashion. Critical if they are going to be relocated. What this does is it attempts to avoid impoverishment. It attempts to solidify the degree of involvement by the government and by also local NGOs. Now, community-based organizations, such as this one, are essential to the social fabric that I was referring to before. And it's been proven with housing in specific that women's role and capacity to organize these community-based organizations is essential. They have the ability to move things forward in a faster, perhaps more organized way. Why? Because they've got better understanding and knowledge of their own communities. Because that's where they are often spending the majority of their time. And because they spend the majority of their time in their communities, they are more likely than men to put emphasis on securing water, sanitation, electricity, because those amenities may be available outside the home to husbands in their place of work. Now, the foundations of participation in this specific case. In the mid-1980s, an eviction notice was received on the railway track. Now, this is important because it was not a forced eviction. They were provided time to plan this. And I've got here the importance of Mahila Milan. Mahila Milan is a women's savings and credit group that has been formed in India and has proliferated to different parts of India and also internationally, which I will come back to. The importance of this 1980s event was that the community came together and they performed a baseline economic and social survey. They mapped their community physically, they mapped their community in terms of household, they mapped what the income levels were, how many family members were there. You can imagine that the government of Maharashtra probably, definitively, did not have this information. They won't send the government officials in to get this kind of baseline information in slums. This picture is a picture of a savings chart of Mahila Milan that I visited. What you can see is that in a single community, there's 20 different societies of saving groups. And you can see what their monthly accumulation of funds is. This is incredibly important. It instills a habit of saving in women of low-income communities. They run and operate credit societies so that a woman can extract a loan, if she needs to, at any time of up to 5,000 rupees. But she must have indicated through an informal credit rating that she's capable of repaying that loan. In addition, they can also take out emergency funds at any point up to 2,000 rupees, which are usually used for childbirth, whereas the other loans are normally used for tuition, school books, transportation for their children, that sort of thing. So when this eviction notice happened, what they decided to do was to cluster the households in groups of 50. And those 50 people would be relocated collectively. So what this did, if you recall my referring to the social fabric issue, was to ensure that neighbors moved with neighbors, that solidarity remained between people. Now, because this happened at one section of the railway, by no means that meant that other sections of the railways were immune to this type of thing happening. What that did was a chain reaction of creating railway slum dwellers societies. In 1987, the Railway Slum Dwellers Federation formed. Now, this is one type of federation under the umbrella of the National Slum Dwellers Federation in India. There are the Airport Slum Dwellers Federation. There's a Harbor Slum Dwellers Federation. This model has managed to take root in different areas of the country and indeed in other countries in Africa and also South America. what happened when the RSDF, this Railway Slum Dwellers Federation, formed was that they hosted a housing exhibition. Given that they knew that they would be responsible for relocating, they managed to use, with Mahila Milan, the funds that had been saved to construct what they thought would be an appropriate house for size, materials, layout, various different models. And they held a housing expedition. This served to increase their visibility. In excess of 20,000 people came to see this exhibition, other slum dwellers. So of course this, again, creates this thing, a chain reaction. So, based on this, government negotiations began in which Mahila Milan and the RSDF were responsible for this relocation. And this resulted in what's called the Rehabilitation and Resettlement Policy. And what this did, what this stipulates, is 4 things. That relocation be in a relative proximity to existing locations so as to maintain economic activities. That complete security of tenure be granted. No more of this, they're illegal, they don't really count. That the resettlement resulted in an improvement in their living standards. And that the resettlement did not disrupt their social networks. These are the 4 baseline issues that this piece of legislation, this Rehabilitation and Resettlement Policy, targeted. Going back, now a color slide of the railway tracks. The Western, the Central, and the Harbor. In 1999, there were demolitions of housing based on infrastructure development between Cordula and Thane. So this whole strip. Tanya, thank you. The importance of this is that, again, Mahila Milan and RSDF came together in order to organize this, this resettlement. But the project-affected households, the people who were actually going to be relocated, took it upon themselves to search out a new location where they wanted to live. Once they found that, they actually organized a collective date of moving, how they were going to bring all their possessions to this new location, and finally, how to pack their belongings so that they could move sort of in a streamlined way. This counteracts entirely what I was saying before about forced evictions, where bulldozers come and men and women and children have literally minutes to get out of their house. So this is incredibly important. Now, what they did, almost 2,000 households were affected in this initial set of demolitions. And there's a preliminary shift of 900. They selected Kanjurmarg, am I saying that correctly? Now, interestingly enough, Kanjurmarg was actually a salt pan plain, so it was quite marshy. And the project-affected households actually arranged that it be filled so that it would be suitable for construction. They then also arranged for potable water to be put in, which required that an access road be built. This map shows the relocation sites of further demolitions. In this round of demolitions, 2,300 households were affected. Now, importantly, when these demolitions occurred, this time people did not receive notice. It was indiscriminate. Bulldozers came in, and while they said that they were targeting only those houses who had not shown proof of residence before 1995, the reality of that was quite different. The interconnected nature of slums means that when you knock down one house, the other house is not going to stay standing just perfectly. So 2,300 households were affected. Based on this, the World Bank forcibly said all project-affected households, every house that was ruined, would be included in the resettlement. What this meant was that even if a household did not have proof of living in the city before 1995, it didn't matter. They're in. They're going to be resettled. Now, this is critical because there was only an availability of 4,000 households. And there was actually a need for 10,000. Here's a picture from that alley that I took to show some of the examples of the living conditions. This is really an alleyway in Dharavi. Now, so from conditions such as these, Mahila Milan and the RSDF began to hold regular meetings to share information, to get information back from the community in order to plan moving them between permanent, I'll go back, and transit accommodation. So this is exemplified the permanent or the residential tenements by the blue squares, the transit accommodation by the red triangles. So you can see that they were spread out across the city in different areas. So there's Kanjarmarg there. Now, because of the fact that there was 10,000 households that needed to be resettled and availability of only 4,000, how are you going to decide who's going to move where? Obviously, permanent housing is more desirable because you don't have to move again. It's going to be better quality housing. Transit housing is going to be specifically built for short-term residents. And then within a year or two, they'll move again. So a big issue is, how do you choose? Well, again, this comes back to the role of community organizations. They know their community. They have this information based on this baseline survey that they undertook. So they developed a point system. The point system was based on size of the household, how many children were there, the household age structure, so that if there was elderly people, that they would be granted priority, the health, overall health of the household, female-headed households, and general vulnerability. Each individual society that I was referring to before scored each household in order to determine who would move to permanent and who would move to transit housing. So there's an alleyway in Dharavi. Dharavi on the left, slums along the railway to the right. These are the types of conditions in which they were living. The next slide I'll show you is the permanent housing that I was referring to and the transit housing. This is a massive change on a number of different levels, from living in high-rises to living on a single level. And again, I come back to the age structure of the households. You can't assign a household of a 70-year-old and a 75-year-old woman to that level. So there's a huge amount of planning in what happens. Nor can you assign a new mother with 3 children to that, because we'll have to be carrying them up and down the stairs continuously. Now, what are the lessons learned from this? Let me re-emphasize that this resettlement experience is not a panacea. It's not a magic box that you can take this model, apply it in the country, and that you've got your resettlement done, tidy, and clean. Not at all. The people that I interviewed did note concerns. They noted that there were reduced employment opportunities, a loss of livelihood, that their children were having to commute much further to go to school, that the living space was actually smaller than what they originally had. And again, their own lengthy commuting from their current areas to their previous employment. Now, if I can, I'm going to go back again. Have a look at these pictures. While the transit housing does look to be second class, the permanent housing was supplied with individual water taps and toilets inside each tenement, each apartment. My initial reaction to that was, that's fantastic. They've now got in-house water supply and sanitation. Except when a woman told me, I wish they'd asked me if I wanted that. and I asked the transit, I said, okay, let's go into this. This is important. And what she said was, well, sure, it's great that we have it, but no one asked us if we could afford it. In slums, people have illegal connections. They may pay an alternative water supplier a certain amount of money. They may share a connection, But when they all of a sudden are responsible for the formal payments that we are all used to, when they have this new life experience of moving to a new area, new opportunities for employment or loss of employment, it becomes extremely complicated. And that comment absolutely fascinated me. So, I dug a little bit deeper on this. A woman, this was in Manipur, said to me, well, living in transit isn't so bad. It's kind of like training wheels. I said, training wheels? How is it like training wheels? Because in the transit sites, 14 houses would share a single water point. And they would all have to pay for it every month. But it's a gradual process. They started to learn how to be more formal, instead of the immediate formality which was required in the permanent housing. So it was a very interesting dichotomy between the two. Now, let's go back to this issue of economics. Because of the fact that there were lost incomes and that it was difficult for certain people to maintain their jobs, Mahila Milan took active steps in both permanent and transit housing in all of those sites, every single one of them, to assist as much as possible with the community so as to prevent what's called speculative or distressed selling. The easiest thing for a poor household to do when they need money, sell their house. And hey, those aren't half bad coming from where they were. But that wasn't allowed. It's a very difficult thing to investigate because people are very secretive about it. So in order to prevent distressed selling, Mahila Milan took a number of steps. They set up ration shops that operated at a zero profit margin, that provided subsidized goods, subsidized kerosene. They also set up a nursery in the different areas that would provide for up to 50 children, ages 2 to 4, to be cared for, and they apparently also provided classes in English and Marathi to the older kids. Now what this did was it was really trying to maintain, or at least to minimize, the economic burden that the project-effective households were experiencing. So what does it all mean? Urban development is linked to the reorganization of city spaces, as I mentioned before, and evictions are often the norm in developing countries. It's far easier to go in with bulldozers than to go through this process. Mumbai has set a precedent with this accomplishment, and it comes back to the example of training wheels, that it can be a gradual process. But let me underscore that this by no means has meant that in Mumbai, indiscriminate evictions and bulldozing has stopped. It unfortunately has not. Even 2 years ago, 300,000 people were displaced. The importance of this case is not the fact that it is, as I said, a magic box that will solve everything. It indicates the possibility of what can be done, if done in a sequential and organized fashion. The bottom line is that this example of participation in resettlement exemplifies genuine partnerships between key stakeholders that sustains vital social networks and safety nets that communities offer to their citizens. Thank you very much for your time. I'd like to open the floor to questions, discussion, and conversation.